along to the history program, the Limerick Historical Society, with me, Tony Brown, and of course, usual, I have with me Tom Donovan. Tom, you're welcome to the program anyway.
Good evening, Tony.
I don't really have to say that because you're with me all the time. It's like my shadow. And tonight, we have a different guest again. Tonight, we have Paul Ritchie, who's pastor of the Baptist Church. Should I give you, first of all, Paul, you're welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much, Tony.
You're a pastor.
Yeah.
Is that the correct title?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that entail like as pastor?
Well, we would be very low church. So I always say that pastor is a job description rather than a title. We don't technically do ordination. We do have a structure that's very democratic. Our structure in the church is primarily the members' meeting. So you have a members' meeting that are the body that look after the church. And then underneath the members' meeting or alongside the members' meeting, you have the elders. We have 3 elders, of which I'm one. Technically, an elder and a pastor is the same thing, but the person who gets paid as such, myself, we just, for shorthand, we just call that person the pastor. But I work as a team of elders. And then under that, we have deacons. The deacons look after more of the buildings, that sort of thing. So we have and then we're a part of an association. So when I became a part of the Baptist Association 10 years ago, it was explained to me that it's technically not a denomination, but an association of independent churches. There's a growing number around the church, quite a growth in Cork in particular. They tend to be a little bit more culturally conservative in the north. So, Tony, you turned up at the end of the service last Sunday. You'll see that I was dressed pretty much the same clothes as I am now. Whereas up north is more sort of shirts and ties, but they're a bit more like that.
Just start again. First of all, I should tell you that about, I think it was in 2005, I was looking up my notes today. I already had on the history program that I had on RLO radio, I had a Sam Devine.
Yes, Sam Devine was my predecessor.
Yeah, and also I think Mark Morris.
Yeah, Mark Morris is now living in Australia, but he was a key member. He would have been a deacon, I think, at that time. And so he was he was a treasurer at that time.
I voted him on the program talking about the church. But just to explain from the beginning, we'll talk about the old church now, which a lot of different people will remember. But what are Baptists? What do you kind of, not what you believe in, but how different are you, in other words, you know?
That's a really good question, Tony. And it's always one I'm trying to get people to be prepared to answer when they're asked it. The title kind of gives a bit of it away. So the distinctive feature of the Baptist Church is that we have a baptism, which we see as symbolic rather than an actual sort of, a sacrament. So we see baptism as a picture of washing away of your sin, and the idea of going down to die to your old self and being raised to new life. So it's a picture of conversion, Christian conversion. And we're called Baptists because we, the distinct thing really of groups who are Baptistic is that rather than baptize infants before they can choose, we allow people to grow up and make that choice for themselves. Also, rather than sprinkling with water, we do baptisms. There's a pool at the front of the church. So underneath the pulpit in the church, if you lift off that pulpit, there's a kind of a bath that goes up to chest height. But also we do a lot of baptisms in places like Killaloe. We go out to Killaloe and we would bring people out there, and we'd, in the summertime, obviously. So in the wintertime, we have a heated pool as such. And in the summertime, we go out to Killaloe. So the main...
Thank God for that. Well, I would like to live it to freezing cold anyway.
Absolutely not, Tony. And the main, so that would be the main, why we got the name. Because as you know, with a lot of these groups like the Quakers and the Methodists and the Baptists, they were names given to them by people outside the group. So Baptists were known for their practice of adult baptism. Interesting. Oh, sorry.
Were were you born into the church, or did you? And do children follow their parents, or do they wait?
Yeah. So I grew up Methodist, and when I was in college in Dublin I was studying geography and economics. That was sort of the time where I started investigating Christianity on a personal level. And then I went into the Methodist ministry for a while. I was about 12 years a Methodist minister. My views probably had become quite Baptistic during that time, and I remember going to the people in the Methodist Church, the board of examiners, and telling them this, and they were quite happy for me to continue there. But my theology would have been more in line with the Baptist Church. So we were very happy in the last church we were in, which is a Methodist church, but at the time they kept moving ministers from place to place. So at that time, I decided I wanted to come to the South, and I wanted to be in a church where I could stay a long time as a pastor. And obviously the choice then for me was to go into the Baptist church, because that would have fitted what I believed best. We have a very interesting thing, Tom, though, that most of our people wouldn't think of themselves as Baptist. They would think of themselves as born-again Christians or evangelical Christians, and all those words come with their own baggage, as you can imagine. But very few of our people would think of themselves as Baptists, and actually very few of them grew up in Baptist churches. We have quite a variety of people. So most of them would just talk about themselves being Christians. And if you ask them what was distinctive about their faith, they would probably say the concept of personal relationship with God. So rather than, becoming a Christian by being born into it or going through sacraments and so on, they would talk about a decision that they made at some stage in their life that they wanted to put Jesus, first.
And sorry, a few things just coming to my mind now. First of all, what I think, I didn't realize this even till a book I've read a few months ago on the Cromwellian period in England, and it covers a very short time actually. Which I thought, when I was young, when I first got interested in history, I thought the Cromwellian period was for about 200 years, and I think it was only about 5 or 6 years, 1649, I think, to about 1656 or that. Anyway, but during that, they say, the guy that wrote the book, I should say, said that there was kind of commotion in England, for other words, because of the Puritans. And with lots of other groups that came up, like the Liberals, the Quakers, and then it says Baptists. So are they the same Baptists that you remember?
They would be a similar.
What's your connection then with when I think of Baptists, I think of America, the southern states. So what is the connection between the whole lot?
Well, Baptists are a bit slippery that way, because if you go to America, you get different Baptist unions or Baptist associations. So sometimes you would get groups who come across here who call themselves independent Baptists. And the irony of that is they're generally from the southern states in America, and they're from groups of more sort of conservative Baptist groups. They would emphasize things they might, for example, only read from the King James Version or whatever. We'd be from a slightly broader group of Baptists. We're a part of an association, but there would be a similar root. I suppose two historical figures that we might look at is if you think about around the time of the Cromwellian period and the Act of Conformity and so on in England, where it would be someone like John Bunyan. Do you remember? So John Bunyan was Baptist. He was the writer of Pilgrim's Progress, as you know. So that sort of tradition of a non-conforming church would be the sort of roots, but they tend to have loose roots, or if you know what I mean. And our own church has a very strange history, where we go back to about 1850. So you have the building on O'Connell Street. You remember that booklet I gave you in that. So you go back to the building on O'Connell Street. But I'll get it back at some stage, but there's no rush. But in fact, I learned a lot from reading that book. I read that book. That was one of the previous pastors wrote that book. But the thing that I found very interesting about that was the church that is the Baptist Church in Limerick. It goes back to about 1894, the building on O'Connell Street, as you know. But before that,
I interrupt you again, Paul. Just explain what that church is. Most people will know it.
It's St. Joseph's Community Centre, beside St. Joseph's Church on O'Connell Street, on O'Connell Avenue.
Should I say opposite, what's it called, pub, South Pub?
Exactly, South Pub is exactly. So you go back to 1895 or whenever. But the interesting thing for me is that church, that congregation, was actually not originally Baptist. Before that, they were Congregational. Now Congregational and Baptists are, and this is when you're looking in at the outside at evangelicalism, it's very confusing. Because, you know, you have different groups around the city, Abundant Life in Henry Street, there's Elevate Community Church near St. Mary I. We've all good relationships. We all believe pretty much the same thing. But the Congregationalists were an interesting group because the Congregationalists, the term Congregationalist, was to do with their type of government. So if you have, say, a Presbyterian means elder or overseer. They were the guys in charge. If you think of an Episcopal church, that's the bishop, like the Church of Ireland or the Catholic Church. And a Congregational church, it's the congregation that have the final say in what goes on in a church. Congregationalists and Baptists are very similar, except for one thing, and that was whether you baptize as an infant or whether you baptize as an adult. So what happened was that around the 1890s, a guy called Brown, like yourself, somehow I think he was related to Brown Thomas, you know, those Browns. He came along and they had a debt in the Congregational church. And he said to them, I will become the pastor of your church and pay off your debts as long as you become a Baptist church. Now, that was an interesting thing for them because some of them said, but we don't believe in baptizing adults. We baptize our babies like everybody else. And they came to an agreement that it would become a Baptist church, but that the members who wanted infant baptism, who had been baptized as infants, could become members as long as they agreed with everything else the church taught. Now, that actually, guys, is a really relevant thing to a debate that's happening in the church at this very moment, this year, because we have three groups of people in our church, really. We have the New Irish, you know, people from East Asia. We have people from Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, and so on, a couple of Americans, Canadians. And some of the people, and then I should say the three groups, then we would have people, I would say, who grew up in what might be Protestant or evangelical churches. And then we have people who grew up in Catholic backgrounds, who got involved, particularly in the 1970s, who got involved in a movement that was going on around the city, where they became evangelical Christians or born again. But the interesting thing that we have at the moment, and this relates back to the 1890s, is that some of the people who came to our church from other countries were Dutch Reformed from South Africa. And they settled in our church. But as you might know, they believed in infant baptism. And at the moment, to be a member, to be on the membership meeting, you have to be baptized as an adult. So those of us in the leaders, or certainly two of us in the leadership, are saying, well, actually, the history of our church allows for membership of people who don't share the church's view on baptism, because the roots of the church, going back to the 1850s, was of a situation where the church moved from being a Congregational church to a Baptist church, and they came to an agreement on baptism that this group in the 1890s, made up of Congregational and Baptist, would agree to disagree on the issue of baptism. So it's a current debate that goes all the way back to the 1890s.
Paul, why was the Baptist Church so late in coming to Limerick?
That's a good... And funny thing too about that, Tom, is my knowledge of history goes back to Methodism rather than the Baptists.
Yeah.
So I looked at Wesley's. I studied geography in college in Dublin, and I did a dissertation on the geography of Methodism, which had a fair degree of history in it. Wesley, as you know, visited from 1747. He visited 22 times, I think, to Ireland. I can only assume that the relationship is a little bit similar. I suspect that it will have been to do with, as you know, groups outside the Catholic Church made limited progress. You know, the Methodists made most progress among non-Catholic groups, particularly out of the Church of Ireland, and then with the Palatines coming across as well, as you know. My suspicion is that I'm told, I'd need to check this in the book, that some of it, the areas where the church grew was in the garrison, you know, with soldiers. So there was a movement there. There would have been, I think, a sort of certain chaplaincy work done there. And obviously that then changed with 1922 and so on. And then, of course, you know that 25 years ago, we sold that building in town, and then we moved to Caherdavin. And I would suspect that at that stage, it was felt that the building in town would have been far too big for the congregation. They probably had very small numbers. I'm thinking that when they came out to Caherdavin, they might have, and again, I'm guessing on this, but, you know, we're talking 20s or less, less than 30 people probably being involved. But what no one foresaw was that people would be coming into our country from a whole array of places, and that hugely boosted our numbers. So now the building we have in Caherdavin is actually too small for us. We have a problem. We're thinking about knocking down a wall. As I say, the congregation is made up of three groups of people that I see, not quite equally divided in three, but you have the people who grew up in Protestant or evangelical churches, some of whom were Baptists, some of whom were Brethren. You have people who've come to evangelical faith from a Catholic background, and then a large number of people who are new residents and new Irish from a whole variety of places.
There are many Catholic churches who would envy you now. I'd say a lot of Catholic churches didn't foresee that either. Paul, can you tell us about John Smith and his relationship with you? Where he founded the church?
Very little. I can tell you very little about John Smith, other than, you know, going back and knowing his. I would have to look up and so on. Bond there. Could I give you another historical figure rather than John Smith? Yeah. You may have heard. I don't know if you've ever heard of Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon was a preacher in London in the latter half of the 1800s. Now, that is the same time as Brown turns up. And we have a picture in our study of Spurgeon. There's some link in the church between Spurgeon and Brown. I don't know if it's a funding link. Spurgeon was an interesting person. He was called the Prince of Preachers. And you know, these massive churches you might see on the television in America. Spurgeon was the preacher who was speaking to thousands of people in what was called the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London in the late 1800s. A very interesting man, a very, there were three preachers around that time that were particularly noted, but people would have traveled a great distance. And because that church was growing, so Brown had some connection with Spurgeon, and we have a picture of Spurgeon in our study. So that's in terms of John Smith and people like that, we obviously have, again, the roots going back. So I'll give you another thing, and this shows my eclectic understanding of church history. If you go back to the Reformation, you might remember the name the Anabaptists. Yes. So they were yes. But the interesting thing is, I was reading someone else who was criticizing the Baptists, and they said, these guys are Anabaptists. They are not our root. Anabaptists are an unusual group of people arriving in Zwingli's Zurich. They were wanting to baptize people the way we baptize people. You might remember there was an offshoot of them that had a rebellion in a place called Munster, which was not our Munster. And this guy who's trying to criticize us, as in mainstream Baptists, is going, you can't forget these things. But the interesting thing is, as far as I can see, there is no direct link between the Anabaptists around the post-Reformation period and people like Smith and so on afterwards. The Anabaptists, their link goes to the Mennonites, the Amish. Those were where those guys went. But Smith and the others were different groups. But you seem to have, in the early Baptists, you have groups in America, but you also have groups like those that John Bunyan was a part of, which is probably more of a historical route to look to us. And that push during the time of the Act of Conformity away for independent.
What age, Paul? Is there an actual age to be baptized?
No, it's not. It's
what if you have a child, which I don't have? If you have a son, would just say of about 8 years of age, when should he be baptized?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that sort of every parent goes through. So, it's not unusual, for example, for a child to grow up in church and be enthusiastic about church and then become a teenager, a young adult, and throw it all away. And sometimes after that, come back. And so you would get, there's no age set. The only thing is that you've got to be cognitively aware of what you're doing. In terms of you've got to, because it's about a decision. You're given baptismal promises. You're asked about the nature of your faith. So we've often, and it tends to be a decision parents make in conjunction with their child. And so sometimes you'd get a 12 or 13-year-old. Generally, we're baptizing people in their 20s, often students, because they've sort of grown up in a evangelical home. They've settled in a church. They want to put their roots down there. They want to declare their faith publicly. Often, the idea too of Baptists would often put an emphasis on your baptism being a time of public declaration, which is why it's particularly attractive to do it in a public place like Killaloe, because you can invite your friends along. I stand in the water with them, and I'd often say, well, what brought you to this point? What helped you make this decision? And they would talk to the people gathered there about that. We might sing a song, and then you have the baptism, and would share some food afterwards.
Yeah. Tell me this: how in America then? It's amazing the way. I know there are probably different sects of types of Baptists. You can explain in a second, but to me, they were just Baptists.
Yeah.
In America.
Yeah.
And you see these huge halls where you see people, I will take the devil from you, and he taps you on the forehead and the people fall back, as you say, which also, incidentally, when you've seen it or not, now it wasn't vulgar or anything, but the Simpsons did a thing in it when Ned Flanders found out that Bart and his sister weren't baptized, and he was going to he was going to baptize them in the river. Homer found out, and he saved them just in time before he was about to duck them in. And also, there was a friend of mine, which you might have known years ago, he's dead about 4 years now, Frank Hogan. He used to have a sign called John 3:7, which I made for him, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Frank always considered himself as being born again. So what's the connection between the Baptists and between the born again and that?
Yeah, traditionally in the city, the two churches that would have been sort of evangelical, you'd obviously the Methodists and Presbyterians whose roots are in evangelicalism, but not everybody in the Methodist and Presbyterian church would want to necessarily call themselves evangelical. So evangelicalism is a movement that emphasizes, there's a guy, Bebbington, he's a historian in Queens. I don't know if he's still alive, but he wrote a book about the church in England. And he described evangelicalism with 4 words. I hope I can remember them. Conversionism, this idea that you come to a moment in your life where you decide for yourself, rather than sort of a sacramentalism where it's done for you. So conversionism, biblicism, the emphasis on scripture being the sole authority. So that was the second one. And if you would come to our meeting, you'd know I preach for 25 minutes straight off a text. We're working through the Gospel of Mark at the moment. Some churches I know would go for 40 minutes. I talked to a guy in town today, or last Sunday, he preaches for an hour. So conversionism, biblicalism, what is it? Activism. You think of people like Wilberforce, he was an evangelical. Conversion and cruciformism, it's around the cross. So the message is very much the cross of Christ, him taking our sins, him being our hope, not about what you do for him, but what he has done for you. So those are the 4 things that mark evangelicalism. Within the city of Limerick, you would have a variety of churches that would be evangelical. Someone like Abundant Life, Elevate Community Church. There's a church in Windmill Lane, the New Testament church. There's a variety of African churches, particularly Nigerian churches. Traditionally, Methodism was very evangelical. It was an evangelical movement. And what you find is that there's a core of belief that those evangelicals all agree on. There's great people like the Guinnesses, were evangelical. Arthur Guinness, particularly his son was evangelical. Then you go to Powers Court. There's a guy, J.N. Darby, who was the starter of the Plymouth Brethren. He was Irish. So you go along that. So traditionally in the city, the 2 evangelical churches, other than the Methodist and Presbyterian, which would have at times been very evangelical, but the 2 sort of independent evangelical churches was Mallow Street Brethren Church on Mallow Street, the hall, and the Baptists. And they related a lot to each other. Those are the sort of the 2 older evangelical churches, ourselves going back, if you count the Congregationalists, right into the 19th century.
Where does the Quakers come in this now?
The Quakers are interesting too, because of course they would have an evangelical theology as well. Within evangelicals, you then have this thing called Pentecostalism, which is much more experiential. The Quakers, of course, would share in the roots of that. But as far as I know, the Quakers wouldn't consider themselves an evangelical church now.
They don't have a preacher as such.
Exactly, but there'll still be roots there that go on. So evangelicalism is like a movement. Sometimes exists within a church, like the Anglicans. You would have an evangelical wing. Other times, the whole church itself could be defined as evangelical. And then, of course, you have another interesting one, which is the relationship between evangelical and Pentecostal. Pentecostal is more, it's a type of evangelicalism that emphasizes experience more. And then you have evangelical and fundamentalist. Fundamentalist. So what they say about fundamentalists is I gotta be careful here because there's a lot of good people, a lot of fun, a lot of mental, but not a lot of fun, but that's probably not a charitable thing. But they would emphasize more things, like they might have particular peculiarities, like reading only from a certain version of the Bible, like the King James Version, and so on.
And just Tom, you kind of confused with all these now.
Yeah, but
Tom. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Well, and through history, you come across the different sects. But what is there an effort to grow the church? You mentioned there how the church grew, but do you spread the gospel or conversion? Do you have conversions or try to get people into the church?
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. Remember when I said the 4 features of evangelicalism? Conversionism is one of them. You think of the Great Commission, where Jesus sends them out. One of the big questions is how to do that in a modern Ireland. We're used to, you don't get a lot of welcome when you knock on someone's door, but we have gone around and handed out magazines. A thing that's very effective would be sometimes to have your carol service where you invite your friends to come. We're not trying to build our own church so much as we're trying to introduce people into relationship with Jesus. So we try to introduce people into a living relationship with Jesus, but we try not to make it about our church. If you think of, say, historically pre-Vatican II, where the Catholic Church would have seen itself really as the only pure church, the relationship between conversion and being a Catholic was very tight. But for our church, we see people having that relationship with Jesus in all sorts of churches. So we're not trying to make.
You don't go knocking on doors, Paul, so do you?
Pardon?
You don't go out knocking on doors like we say, like the Mormons do or the Jehovah's do.
We would sometimes, but not. We used to hand out a magazine, and what we would do there, Tony, with the magazine is we would go out with the magazine, and the magazine, was just something about faith. It might have a relevant article and we'd give it to people. Sometimes you'd just put it through the door. Sometimes you'd knock on the door. I would always say to people, though, don't shove this down their throat. Hand them the magazine. Tell them it's for free, because it is. And in that magazine, sometimes you might have had, say, like a free book that you could write in for. And that was a way of giving people the opportunity, if they wanted to know more, you were making yourself available without shoving, yourself down the throat. We have one guy, John Ryan, he's a very good guy. And sometimes he would go out on the streets. You might see someone at times with a sketchboard. So he would be trying to outline the Christian message sort of on the streets. We do something too, which is we've occasionally had, say, a speaker come down. We had David Blevins from Sky News, who's a friend of mine. And so David would come and we had him talk about, it was an Easter talk. So it was called A Journalist Investigates the Resurrection. So he looked at the evidence for the resurrection. He had a sort of a lighter talk that was more popular, which was his encounters with Bill Clinton, because he was American correspondent around the Clinton time, and he had interesting insights. But you're sort of trying to invite people to come into the community. But one of the things we would be very keen on is that we're not trying to make Baptists out of anybody. We're just trying to introduce people to the person of Jesus.
And Paul, how did you get to Ireland? I mean, did you come here to study or?
Oh, I grew up in Cork.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. I'm sorry about the accents, Tom.
Yeah.
I grew up in Cork. I always say, Tom, that when I was a 10-year-old in Cork, I was going by the Grand Parade, the cinema, the Capitol Cinema was there. There was 4 of us, and this girl lunged out at us and she says, "Here, if you pay for it, I'll give you a snog." And that's always my story about what the Cork accent's like. I went to college in Dublin, and I went to school actually in Dublin as well. And then I lived for quite a while up north, but Cork is my home.
All right.
Yeah.
Did you ever come across a man by the name of Livingston Cooney?
Yes, Livingston Cooney was a great historian. He died a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I actually followed Livingston Cooney in a in a church. And you know how he had that wonderful accent?
No, but he
had a stutter. When he was a child, he had a stutter. And he was sent to elocution lessons for the stutter. And he was left with that beautiful posh accent that he had. And he was such a beautiful orator. But the funny thing about Livingston... But the funny thing about Livingston Cooney was that Dudley Livingston Cooney was that he was very popular in his churches. And you might have thought a man who came across as, prim and proper wouldn't. I followed him in Lisnaskey and Newton Butler in Fermanagh. I wouldn't have thought it would have been Dudley's place. And in fact, when Dudley was told that he was going there, he later told me he didn't think it was his place either. In fact, he went to the stationing committee and he says, Dudley has nothing to say to Newton Butler, and Newton Butler has nothing to say to Dudley. But they sent him there anyway. They loved him, and he loved it because he was a very sincere man.
He was in Rathkeil, that's why I got to know him.
Yeah.
And he came on a trip with us to France one time. He had to go to a service with Lorna Shire, Tom. Do you remember Lorna Shire?
Yeah.
Lorna was a member of the Methodists as well, and they had to go to a service. I think it was about 40 miles away on a Sunday morning. They went off in a taxi, they did, after the service. I came back to the hotel afterwards then when it was over. But anyway, I remember he wrote another history actually of the Methodists.
It's a very good history of the Methodists. And it's in some ways, you'd have to say it's the definitive history of Methodism in Ireland. If you were introduced, also, Tony, you were asking me about the situation in America. Yeah. Maybe the situation, because, Tom, you asked me about the relationship with Smith. Maybe the situation in America shows something about what Baptists are like. And what I mean by that is, so with Methodism, you get that clear historical route right back to Methodism. Or to Wesley, you get a very clear line. With Baptists, it's often very hard to figure out where they emerged from, and some of that's illustrated in America because in America, you have different big unions. I can think of three. I'm sure if there was an expert, they could think of tons of them. And maybe I could add a fourth. You have the independent Baptists. They're sort of very deep South, very culturally conservative, very into things like, for example, reading only from the King James Version, dating back to 1611. Then you have the Southern Baptists. That's the difference between the independents and the Southern is that the Southern was a union, a connection, an association. The independent Baptists said, we're an independent church. We're not a part of any denomination, even though they had all these networks. The Southern Baptists, now they have an unfortunate history because they were set up by slave owners.
That's what we're going to come to actually now, about how were there so many slaves involved in the Baptist movement.
Exactly. So you have the Southern Baptist, and you have a break between, I'm talking about things I only know briefly about, but the Southern Baptist was set up by slave owners who didn't want to, who wanted to keep their slaves. And then you had the Northern Baptists who were progressive on the issue of slavery and against slavery. The interesting thing is, and then you might have had a whole proliferation of Black churches, African Baptist churches, because they're all independent. You can set one up. You could technically open a Baptist church yourself, Tony. In the sense that
keep that in mind.
Keep that in mind. If the history doesn't work out. But the interesting thing about the Southern Baptists in America is that those Southern Baptists, they have repented of that history. So they've really tried to make strides to get rid of that history, to recover from that history. They would have some connections with some of the people in Cork, because because they've moved, they even tried to change their name from Southern Baptists with that history of slavery to Great Commission Baptists with an emphasis on evangelism to try and get rid of, the dark roots of their history. But there's some very good, so they obviously have a certain bad name, but they have some very good people in that church now.
They seem to get tremendous crowds. All the churches, especially in the southern states. When I think of Alabama, I think of Baptists. We should explain where your church is, the current church. We never got around to that. You moved from O'Connell Street, where we call it O'Connell Avenue.
Yeah.
The old church across from South's Pub. You moved from there to Cardavan. When and why? Will you explain that what's going on?
I will. Okay, so about it was 1993, I think, that we moved. So we're just over 25 years. 4 years ago, we had our 25-year service. We invited down a guy called Trevor Ramsey, who was the pastor at the time, who had been responsible for moving out.
He lived near me, actually. I remember years ago, Ramsey. He did, yeah.
So he's a good guy. So he was responsible for moving out. There was really two things that I think motivated that move. One was that the church had become too big for them. The numbers had declined. And as you know, and in our church, if you use the word Protestant, a lot of people would be very upset by that because they just see themselves as Christians. They don't see, they don't like labels. And obviously Protestant's a particular label with a lot of history in this country. But a lot of those Protestant churches and groups like the Brethrens and all the rest, the numbers were declining since about 1922, it had come to a stage where I think the upkeep of that building on O'Connell Avenue was too expensive. Also there was things like it's there's no parking and stuff like that. And the idea that Trevor had really was to move across to a suburb which was growing at the time, which was Cardavan, and to plant a church right in the community that would be able to do so. For example, his wife used to run a mother and toddlers club, or a parents and toddlers, or whatever, a tots club, and the idea was to build connections with the community, and so the idea of planting it there. Interesting thing though, and we tried to have good relationships with everyone, and I hope I won't offend anyone in saying this, but I was at a wedding not so long ago, a few years ago, and a guy said to me he was in Mass in Cardavan around the time that the Baptists were moving. And this shows how attitudes in Ireland were different in 1993. He said, I don't know what the exact words, but the priest apparently said, what have we done in our area that a group like this would move in? And we were probably seen as, bordering on a cult. And the guy just said to me, we have never had any trouble from anyone, that way. Although it's interesting to read some of the graffiti that goes up on your wall. There's still on the door, someone has scratched in, it's either the door or the front paints something like Brits out and foreigners go home. Which obviously, I'm not sure. I think we might have one English person in the church. I
don't know. Even the church now, which is a good thing in one sense, a lot of people wouldn't even know where it is.
Yeah, exactly.
If somebody was to stop people in Limerick tomorrow and say, where is the Baptist church? They'd probably send them to one of the other churches, Exactly. Elevator, one of them,
And it's interesting you should say that too, because there was a little independent Baptist church called Untitled Baptist Church on the bottom part of Mallow Street, opposite the old Presbyterian church. So the red brick Presbyterian church.
Oh, there was inside in the building.
That was a little Baptist church. I met the pastor there one time, very nice guy, an American. Didn't really want anything to do with us though, because he would probably see us as too culturally liberal,
It's still there, actually, that church, is it?
That building, as far as I know, I don't know what happened, whether he had to, he was obviously renting it. The lease came up. I think he's still around. As I say, he's a nice guy, but he runs a Bible study from his home, I think.
This is the last house. It just me, and there was a tailor there for years after us. It's the last building going down Mara Street on the left-hand side.
Exactly.
I've thought about that now. I remember reading the notice on the wall and saying to myself, I must find out about that, but I completely forgot about it.
You asked.
You had the Presbyterians. Sorry, Tom.
We still don't know where the Church in Cardiff is.
Oh, sorry. Easiest way. I'm a Munster fan. So when I told people in the last church that I was moving to Limerick, they laughed. And when I said we're one of the closest churches to Thomond Park, they laughed even more. I'm trying to figure out whether the church building, in Ballinanty is closer to Thomond Park than we are, but we're opposite LIT. So if you go down the road from Thomond Park, LIT is on one side, and beyond the first housing estate, we're just there on the left.
Is there a Woodview shopping centre?
Exactly, just opposite. You're just a little bit further down, Tom, and on your left.
All right.
The Dilly Passing Out is so close up to the roundabout, really, in a sense. Not far from the roundabout.
Exactly.
We'll have to organise an outing there, Tom.
And you know what we do? Sometimes one of the schools, Villiers, used to send out students to their second years, used to come out once a year before the pandemic. And they would go around all the churches and the mosque as well. And they would come and they would ask questions. I used to always pretend to baptize a few of them. I'd bring them down into the baptismal pool. So we can, if you would like to come and see the building, we'll
wait till May or June, and we'll go out some evening.
We'll bring our togs.
Bring your togs, exactly. Tom, I can dunk you.
Or dip me, isn't it?
Well, dippers is another group, exactly.
What? I tell you what, there are a lot of dippers in a village called Jordan.
Ah, yeah.
There now, because I met a few of them in my time, dippers in Jordan, because they again came from in Jordan. You have both Methodists, Church of Ireland, the Catholic, and then you have the dippers. And I know of dippers I do out in County, I won't say where, but I know of a family of dippers I do out in County Limerick.
And you see a lot of these groups, including our own group, sometimes what happens is that as you take, say, for example, the Methodists coming, many of them were former Church of Ireland. You have a movement of even, because that Wesley, by the time he was finished his ministry, he hadn't left the Church of Ireland Church. In fact, he had said, the Church of England Church, he had said that God would leave Methodism when Methodism left Anglicanism. So he was not, and now be careful, it would be someone like Dudley Cooney that you'd want to check, well, not that he's alive anymore, but you find that sometimes what happens is that as a group, like, say, the Methodists move, say, maybe a more liberal direction, you get a breakaway. And so this is why you find a lot of these groups in the same places. So you might have a Church of Ireland beside the Methodist, because it broke away from the Church of Ireland. And you might even get a Baptist, which would be a bit more conservative again, who came out of the Methodists, and so on. Then you could have a Pentecostal group come out of the Baptists, because they think,
In Bedford Road, Limerick, where the remains of the old Methodist Church are still there, luckily enough, to have survived. But next to that, you had an independent church, an independent Methodist church, right next to that, which God is gone, which is a pity. Kate was married.
Frederick Douglass spoke there, the great black orator. He spoke in the independent church. Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, that's interesting. And I would have loved to have read about that. I was going to read about him not so long ago, because we do a course, Tom, in our church. We have found, and maybe this will warm your heart, we have quite a lot of young adults and students. And a few years ago, we did a course called Rooted. And in Rooted, what we did was we sort of took kind of three things. We took Christian doctrine, so we looked at core Christian doctrines like the Trinity, the Atonement, and so on. And we took those doctrines. And then we took church history, and we did a course on church history, and I never realized how much. So we went back to the early church, to particularly people like Augustine, Athanasius, Irenaeus, and then we worked to sort of align. We went into the Middle Ages. We went into even the Reformation, the Anabaptists, the Evangelical Awakening. And then from there, when we came to the 20th century, rather than looking at movement, well, we did look at Pentecostalism, but then we looked at global Christianity. Places like China, where they say there's maybe up to 100 million house church people. And what I couldn't get over was that the young adults loved church history. It was the most popular course. They were flocking to when I say flocking, we're talking 20 people or whatever, but they loved church history. And I think it's because people want a sense of rootedness. And I think one of the challenges for groups like the Baptists, in particular sort of independent churches and Pentecostal churches, is there is this feeling that they've just turned up out of nowhere. We have only one member in our church that I think was in the church before 1990. So there's that rapid turnover. And I think that young people love history because it gives them a sense of where they came from and what they belong to, being something.
And that has got to do with the speaker, somebody that can explain properly. Yeah. Because I've been to historical lectures on Tom, we often spoke about this, that we've had speakers and you wish they were going home, that they were boring. Whereas you get a speaker that can explain and bring it down to a level that you understand, it makes an awful difference,
Yeah, yeah.
But
even with a boring speaker, you can pick up on some things that you go, oh, I never knew that.
Yeah.
I went to there was a girl, I don't know if you know her. She used to come to our church about 10 years ago. Colette Rochford, I think was her name. And she did a history talk in the Frank McCourt Museum, as it was at the time. There was very few people there, but she was talking about the area around St. John's Cathedral and St. John's Church.
Mm-hmm.
I found it fascinating because of people like Thomas Unthank, and the Quaker influence there. And I learned things that I was still driving by there going, like I went into the graveyard to look at his...
It was Lear inside. Huge Unthanks, I know. There's actually portraits in the City Museum of the Unthanks family. Larry Walsh used to have them below John Square. So that they're in the museum, the Unthanks, anyway. But like that, it depends a lot on who's giving the talk at times, you can make it interesting, and not to be kind of above people's heads as such, I saw another thing about the church on Sunday, there were a lot of children there.
Yeah, a funny thing is though, Tony, since the pandemic, I would say the number of children have fallen off a little bit. But we have a good number of children, a couple of Sunday schools. Where we're finding growth at the moment, actually, strangely enough, is I think with the growth of TUS, LIT, our location is becoming more advantageous towards us. So we're getting students coming in from a variety of backgrounds. We have a bunch of lovely Malaysian girls, for example, who live close. They go to TUS, Indonesians, and so on. But yes, young families we have and students, we have a very young profile to our church. We tend to do more weddings than funerals at the moment.
Tell me this, what about funding? Where does funding come from for the upkeep of the church?
Yeah. So at the moment, what we do is we have a couple of sources of funding, but the main source of funding, the funding is all internal, as in we don't have an organization that funds us. Sometimes a new church would come to town and they would have, say, contacts in America. We have nothing like that. And we're all funded internally. And we do have so we encourage our people to give. And last year we had a surplus, the year before we had a surplus. In fact, every year in the last 10 or 15 years, it's being a surplus that has come in. We then give 10% of our money away to other causes. So particularly overseas, we try to support things outside of our own ministry. So we try to put 10% of our money away for that. Yeah. So we have a very healthy budget. But as you saw on Sunday, there's a reasonable good crowd there.
Very good. Yeah, very good note. And it's a lovely setting there, the church itself.
It is. The car park. We had a funny one though, and I remember the last church I was in. We were growing, and we decided it was before 2008, and we had this big plan to build a new building. This is the last church, not this church. And I learned a terrible lesson, because we came up with some of the business people in the church decided that they would buy some land off the church. They would develop houses on that. They would sell the house, but it would be a limited company whose sole purpose was to give to the church. And we would use that money to build a new premises. Well, didn't the local paper ring up? And I sang like a canary. I told them everything. Well, then, of course, it went into the local newspaper, a big headline, £2.5 million on new Methodist building. The people weren't impressed that I've been telling all their stories. So I've got to be careful. But one thing I will say, we in Carrickavon, we actually benefited from, I've got to be careful because a lot of people got hurt during 2008, the crash. But we had sold the land behind our church for development. And then 2008 happened, and we bought that same land back for half the price.
The overflow the car park, is it?
And now we have the overflow car park. But if you're in that space, you'll notice it's a site that runs right into a corner. We've got quite a bit of wasteland at the back that we can do nothing with. But we were one of the few people.
Could you start growing vegetables there and get the
My wife has said that, Tony. My wife has said we should have allotments.
Another question just comes to mind now. What about burials? Are there any restrictions on where you're buried, in other words?
No, I'm not aware of any Baptist church that comes to mind in Ireland that has a burial plot. Like I even know of Quakers that have burial plots. Well, there's one here in Limerick. The Baptists, I'm not aware of any church off the top of my head that has a burial plot with it. There's no concept. It's a very, what you would call low church expression of Christianity. So it's very non-sacramental. Most people, there's a few views about communion in our church, but most of them would have a sort of memorial view of communion, which is the idea this is just symbolic of a reality. It's a reminder of the cross. There would be no some sort of concept of a holy building. In the churches that I've worked in, I've tended to call the buildings rain shelters, because people get sometimes over-attached, particularly to say a building like our own, which is only 25 years old and isn't of massive architectural merit. So you don't want to get over-attached to it. But we also don't have an idea of holy ground. So you're not looking for a sort of a plot on holy ground. So Baptist people, when they get buried, the local...
What about the room up at the back of the church now?
You could do that, but it wouldn't be wise, because what I've noticed...
I'm just wondering now, because I know that all the other denominations, it doesn't matter, because on this program, we've had Robert Carney, who's from the what do you call them, the Mormons, and
yes.
We've contact with him before, what burials. We've had Hiram Wood, who's from the Quakers. And
yes.
They have their own burial grounds, you said, in Ballinaconnor, Anyway, listen, we're finished. We've gone over the hour. We're talking here. And myself and Tom.
Well, if we cut out all the waffle, we might get 5 minutes out of it.
Yeah, I know it's interesting because
That's interesting, you know.
We didn't even get to the Puritans and the Mennonites.
Oh, well, it's funny, Tom. I've got a bit of a grow for the Puritans.
Yeah.
Because the Puritans, obviously, they get a bad history, but some of their writings are very popular among current evangelicals. So there was a preacher in London by the name of Martin Lloyd-Jones, and in the 1960s to 80s, he started reprinting Puritan classics. And they are very popular amongst evangelicals who want to go a bit deeper in their theology. Obviously, they had their issues and the bad press that they get, and yet they write about the love of God, the cross. Their devotional literature can be quite special. And a couple of years ago, I started reading a few of the Puritans just for myself. Of course, Bunyan would have been considered one of the Puritans, and Bunyan's a fascinating character. I struggle with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Bunyan probably did as well. He was incredibly scrupulous. He wrote Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, which was about his own struggle because he had been very profane in his language. And when he became a Christian, he made a conversion experience. He really didn't believe God could forgive him. And he wrote about this in this book, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. And if you ever get a chance to read Grace Abounding, it's a bit of a rant. It's just him worrying about things until he takes some of the promises of God and applies them into his heart. It's really himself working through. Of course, then Pilgrim's Progress was his massive work. And as you know, Bunyan spent time in prison because he refused to stop preaching, and he wouldn't be licensed to use the Book of Common Prayer. He was in prison, I think, for 12 years, and he could have gone out at any stage if he had agreed to sign up to the Act of Conformity. Of course, he didn't. He found that very difficult because one of his kids at home was blind. And he missed that child in particular. And there was another great Puritan who I think was chaplain to Oliver Cromwell called John Owen.
Thomas Naylor was the man who got a terrible gun over from the Cromwellians.
Yeah.
Because he was a Quaker.
Yeah.
And I've read a fair bit about him now. And he got a terrible time. They burnt his tongue even, did it. They put holes in his tongue to stop him from preaching. Yeah.
But one of the things I find very interesting about the Puritans is that when you read about Cromwell outside of this country, he's very differently interpreted than he is inside this country. And as an Irishman, we just can't, it was genocide what he did.
Yeah.
And yet when I was preparing the talks for the period of the Puritans, we had one of our girls actually, she's a young woman, Sarah. Sarah did the talk on the Puritans, and she's a really intellectual girl. She's a really bright girl, very good communicator, and she talked about the Puritans. But the interesting thing is when I was doing research on people like Bunyan and Cromwell would come in, you would get people in America who weren't crazy, who would say how great a man he was. But as an Irish person, you just can't take that.
Yeah, but they were no good for a laughter, the Puritans.
There's a lot of Americans who think Trump was great as well.
And you saw that Trump yesterday said Putin was a great man.
If he was around, he wouldn't be invading Ukraine.
No, this is the problem. I just think what on earth would have happened. That is, though, this is one of the problems we have, Tom, with our connections with America, of course, because culturally, so you look at the labels. We don't want to use Baptist all the time as a label because we're not trying to make people Baptists. And even to be honest, the act of baptism isn't the biggest thing we're about. But you use a word like evangelical. Well, everyone thinks white, gun-toting, Trump supporting, climate denying, anti-vaxxer, whatever. And so you're left in this situation where you're trying to convey a theology that's really related to none of those things, or not committed to any of those things, that is being hijacked by the religious right of America. And it causes a lot of pain for people here.
I don't think Cormac will go down well now to this time with his banning of Christmas. And you know what he banned? He banned with cockfighting and also race meetings, because he meant there were people who were gathering and making up. They were afraid they'd stick a knife in his back at race meetings.
Tony, there's Cromwell is one of them, right? But then you look at, like, we went back right to the early church, okay? And you get a guy, Tertullian. Tertullian's the guy behind the concept of, he very much argued about the Trinity. He's a madman. Tertullian had 3 levels of virginity. He said, you have the virginity that you're born with, then there's that what you keep. And he also approved of marital virginity. So that even when you got married, he thought it was best not to sleep with your wife. And he thought this was the best. And the funny thing is, he in church history comes, and I'm saying to people, but do you realize that if Tertullian, even people like Augustine at times for some of this stuff, and you go, if they lived today and did what they did now, then none of the churches would want them.
Anyway, listen, before we're all excommunicated, I think we'll move
nice to talk to you, boys. God bless.
Thank you for coming on. And we hope to go out during the summer, and we'll have a visit to the church outside. And will you give us tea?
We'll give you tea, of course we will.
Oh, yeah. So
maybe even coffee.
We'll have to do something about that when we go out, because we'll take in another few things around the general area as well, you know. Okay, again, Paul.
God bless, guys.
And the Historical Society, thanks for coming on, okay?
Thank you. Bye, God bless.